The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
We are here today with Ed Lyman, the Director of Nuclear Power Safety with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Ed, thank you so much for joining us on Titans of Nuclear.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah. No, I've been looking forward to talking to you for a long time because you bring, a very alternate perspective to the nuclear industry. You're very involved, participate in NRC hearings and everything. So I wanted to get this opportunity to hear your whole story from the beginning and hear what you have to say.
From the beginning.
Yeah. Tell us about let's go all the way back to your education and where you first heard about nuclear energy at all.
Well, actually, when I was a small child, I had this golden book of atomic energy. You don't want me to go back that far.
No, go back if you did. Go to it.
No, but it had the story of Marie and Pierre Curie, and it was very intriguing. But let's fast forward. So I'm a physicist by training, and at the same time, I've always been engaged in political and public affairs. So I've always been interested in policy, science policy, the environment, and energy, and also peace and security. So all those things kind of in my background. I went to graduate school for physics at Cornell University, and that was in the mid-1980s. And the physics department at Cornell was known for a number of faculty and students who were very interested in applying technical knowledge to public policy issues. So Hans Bethe, who was the Nobel laureate and was head of the theory group at the Manhattan Project. He was a very outspoken physicist on issues of war and peace, and a leader of the notion that scientists had an obligation to use their technical knowledge for improving society. And so at that department, there was a lot of interest in the political ramifications of scientific work in physics. And at that time, the Reagan administration had its Star Wars a strategic defense initiative, which was trying to apply lasers for ballistic missile defense, space-based lasers. And that had profound implications for applied science work in laser physics. And so there was a prospect of a tremendous amount of government funding going into various fields of physics. And so there was a lot of debate whether that money if someone was really opposed philosophically to that program, which would have actually increased instability and increased the threat of nuclear war. Was it responsible for scientists to take funding, even if it's working on a project that their own personal work, which they don't think really had any implications or applications for Star Wars? So you could take the money and do what you were doing anyway and not really have to worry about the consequences. But that didn't sit well with other folks. And so the Cornell actually, graduate student in physics, started a petition drive for physicists who would commit to not taking SDI money. And that actually was, it attracted thousands of signatories around the country. and made Cornell again a focus of this attitude, or this a center of science that's also concerned about the implications of technical work on world peace.
And you were involved with that petition?
Not directly, but I did get involved with the people who were leading the initiative, and that there was study groups and a lot of meetings and discussions with faculty and students about issues of security and physics.
But it was formative for you nonetheless. You saw how a Cornell student could essentially have like a national policy effect.
Yes, but more to the point that physicists could successfully raise issues of the role of science in society, and how science can be used for both good and ill, and how physicists had to accept that responsibility and understand it. And so there were a group of physicists who were leaving academic physics to pursue technical policy analysis and advocacy around those issues. And in fact, the leader or the initiator of that petition, Dr. Lisbeth Gronlund, was my supervisor at the Union of Concerned Scientists for many years until she left last year. So it was a long collaboration starting from that.
And what is the origin story of the Union of Concerned Scientists? And did you enter right after your graduate school studies, or did you have some other places you were in between?
So the Union of Concerned Scientists started in 1969, and it was an effort of largely MIT faculty and graduate students who were of the same ilk, that they were concerned about the possible misuse of science. It was, of course, the height of the Vietnam War at that time, and the peace movement. And so there was a lot of focus on the role of universities in science and in war making. And so the UCS actually grew out of those issues as well. And one of the first public policy issues they took on as an organization was actually nuclear power safety, because at that time there was a great push by the Atomic Energy Commission to build and license new reactors, and the safety regulations had not really caught up with the ambitions at that time. So it was a big issue then, and it's been historically a core issue for UCS all these years, even though the organization itself has grown and now pursues a wide variety of different science and public policy issues. So that's UCS. And when I left Cornell, I went to Princeton University, where there was a group of physicists and other academics who were focused on issues of science and security. And so I entered that field at that time. And one of my first projects was a very interesting issue that had come up at the end of the Cold War, which was because the US and the former Soviet Union were both downsizing their vast nuclear weapons arsenals as a result of the START treaties, that there was actually stockpiles of nuclear weapons materials, both highly enriched uranium and plutonium, that were accumulating in both the US and Russia, and there was no use for them. And so you have the situation of many thousands of nuclear weapons worth of these dangerous materials, which were essentially surplus, and there is no real plan for how to deal with them. So they become a liability because you have to spend a lot of money to protect those materials from being stolen, because they're obviously just a few kilograms of plutonium is enough to make a crude nuclear weapon. So for highly enriched uranium, the solution was fairly straightforward. Highly enriched uranium has a concentration of the isotope uranium-235, which is greater than 20%. And that that's the rough boundary where making a nuclear weapon goes from highly impractical to practical, let's say. But you can reverse the enrichment of highly enriched uranium by diluting it with natural uranium to bring it back down to concentrations well below 20%. In fact, down to the level below 5%, where that's the low enriched uranium that's used in commercial light water reactors today. So there's a pretty straightforward solution to reducing the threat from highly enriched uranium stockpiles, but you can't do that with plutonium because there is no way to dilute or denature plutonium in a way that would make it unusable for nuclear weapons. And so that was the conundrum. And so there was a lot of study at that time how to dispose of this surplus plutonium, both in the US and Russia, by converting it to a form where it'd be less easy to divert or steal the material, either by subnational groups for nuclear terrorism or by the US or Russia itself, if they wanted to reverse disarmament rapidly and start making weapons again. So that was the puzzle.
Mm-hmm. And when did you enter? When did you enter with the Union of Concerned Scientists?
So I was at Princeton for several years. Then I went to a group called the Nuclear Control Institute in Washington, D.C. That's focus was on fissile materials, nuclear proliferation, and nuclear terrorism. And I worked there until 2003 when I started at the Union of Concerned Scientists.
Interesting. And, so you've characterized some of the problems that the Union of Concerned Scientists saw in the beginning and this conundrum with the plutonium that you pointed out. What are the big topic areas for you personally that, you think are, the challenges within, the nuclear industry that, your voice is essential in terms of, solving or calling out or just making people more aware of?
Well, I think today there is a very great challenge in that I think the nuclear industry is at a crossroads. There's obviously the potential benefits of expanded nuclear power as a low carbon energy source that can't be denied. But on the other hand, nuclear power does have safety, security, proliferation, waste, and cost issues that really have to be addressed to a greater extent than they are today, because I don't think the technology can really thrive if those issues are not addressed. And you just have to look at what happened with Fukushima, the Fukushima Daiichi accident in Japan in 2011, where Japan was basing its long-term energy strategy on aggressive use of nuclear power, growth of nuclear power, reprocessing of spent fuel and recycling plutonium in fast breeder reactors. That was really their core energy strategy. It was going to get them to energy independence. And after Fukushima, the industry collapsed. All the reactors shut down for years. They are starting up a few of them gradually, but they're not going to return to their original fleet for decades, if ever. And young people in Japan are losing interest in nuclear power and not even pursuing it as a profession, and which the government has recently flagged as an issue for maintaining the expertise. So you don't want another Fukushima in the industry, and the way to avoid Fukushima is by not assuming that you know things that you don't really know, and that you understand that there are uncertainties and things that are unexpected, and you have to plan for them, and you have to provide for them, and you have to put in safety margins against them. And the problem is that costs money and takes time. And that's something that the industry doesn't think it has right now. And so that's leading to pressure to not learn the lessons of Fukushima, not understand that you need that safety margin, that the investments you make in it are going to pay off in having a safe and secure industry. And so I'm worried that the financial pressure and the political pressure the industry is under to show that it can succeed, that it can thrive and expand and play a significant role in mitigating climate change over the next few decades. That pressure is leading to some cutting of corners, both in design and licensing and oversight of nuclear power, which I'm very concerned about.
So it's interesting because I've got a very different take on, I've been doing this, the Titans Nuclear podcast interview now. I mean, I've interviewed over 1,000 people, but we've got 300 online. I've got a very different take on it. And I'd like to run it by you and hear what you have to say, because the cutting corners thing, I've seen that, let's say, in the automobile industry with the emission standards, and I think it was Volkswagen or one of those companies.
Yes.
They cut corners because of political and financial.
Well, they committed fraud, which is a step beyond.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't see that in the nuclear industry. I mean, I see almost the opposite. I see the nuclear industry has gone so above and beyond in terms of their extra safety measures that they've created this perception that the risk is actually far greater than it is. So a Fukushima story, I see totally, I don't see this as a disaster, right? Like nobody died from the radiation. To me, what Fukushima showed was that we went so far overboard in our safety measures to begin with. It was an accident. Yeah, it broke. Yeah, but so did a bunch of buildings. And those buildings, when they broke, killed people in a tsunami. The nuclear power plant didn't release enough radiation to hurt anybody. So
well, yeah.
But go ahead, please, go ahead.
Finish your thought.
Yeah, it's just, I've seen this, what I've seen over and over and over again is the nuclear, I mean, I'm very critical of the nuclear industry too, by the way, but critical in a different way. I have seen the nuclear industry exaggerate the consequences of radiation, which, by the way, leads to fair criticism from outside groups like yours to think that radiation is much more dangerous than it is. But I've seen the nuclear industry exaggerate the consequences of radiation because that has become the nuclear industry, never-ending upgrades to existing facilities where they're not necessary.
Yes, and I guess I'd say I have to disagree fundamentally, but so let's start with the health effects of radiation. So it's actually a fairly well characterized carcinogen, given the large amount of data that's been accumulated from both intentional and accidental exposures over many decades.
But which one? Which radionuclide specifically are you talking about?
I'm talking about of course, any radioactive isotope that emits ionizing radiation.
But that can't be true. It can't be any radioactive isotope because we're filled with radioactive carbon-14 in our bodies. We're filled with radioactive potassium-40 in our bodies. I mean,
right, but it has to do with the dose and the quality of the radiation, okay. how the exposure occurs.
Yep. So okay, that's fair. I'm glad we drew that.
Any radioactive isotope, any ionizing radiation particle, by definition, can ionize it ionizes atoms in cells, and DNA or genetic material can be the genetic material can be disrupted by ionizing radiation by definition. So there are different types of ionizing radiation. So you have you have alpha particles, which are helium nuclei, which are kind of slow-moving, heavy charged particles, and so they can't penetrate the skin very deeply. So they don't provide much of an internal radiation hazard. But if they're taken internally, then they can do considerable damage to tissues. So plutonium. Right.
But when I work out, I do considerable damage to my tissue also, but it makes me stronger in the net effect. At the end of the day, I'm literally destroying individual cells whenever I work out, and the same happens with radiation. It's very on the micro basis to have radiation destroy a single cell, but that doesn't mean that it's on net leads to a cancer.
Well, it's not destroying. If you kill a cell and it doesn't reproduce anymore, then it can't cause cancer. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about genetic damage that leads to cellular malfunctions and growth and that propagate. And so that, I mean, the genetic basis of the origin of cancer is pretty well established, as is the relationship between ionizing radiation exposure and cancer at low levels. And of course, when the level of radiation exposure gets high enough, then you do have cell death. And you do have that it is strong enough to actually kill cells to prevent them from reproducing. And that leads to what are called the acute effects. So if you think of the aftermath of Hiroshima or Chernobyl,
the acute effects.
Individuals who got acute radiation exposure, there's a very well characterized acute radiation syndrome.
Yeah, no debate. No debate on acute.
Right, but of course, when you get into what are called the stochastic effects, that is random. So a particle of ionizing radiation can randomly strike a cell, cause genetic damage, and then the risk of that lesion actually becoming a cancer depends on a lot of different factors. But there, over a large body of evidence and data, you can develop correlations. But
statistically, we've been able to tease out a threshold for a dose really being a problem, right? Can we agree on that?
No. I mean, there's a difference between there actually being a threshold and being able to measure the effects of very low doses in a statistically significant way. So the argument is often made that the largest body of evidence for the dose response, the relationship of radiation exposure to disease, was developed from the lifespan study of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. And of course, that's a huge population of people. They've been followed their entire lives, and the data continues to grow. And as the data accumulates, you can lower the dose threshold of statistical significance. So that's the data has established that there is this roughly linear relationship between ionizing radiation exposure and cancer risk on average over a population. And so that down to about 10 rem, that's statistically significant. So then the issue is, well, below that, there just aren't enough cancers and the population isn't big enough. So you can't tease that out over the background rate of cancer in the population. So then the question is, but you have this linear relationship, can you extrapolate and assume that it will continue to decrease linearly or below the dose where you have statistically significant data or not? So it doesn't mean that that's a threshold, it just means that you can't, the statistics aren't good enough for you to say, but there are very compelling,
but that's not exactly true, because there's a practical threshold at the end of the day. Then if you can't tease it out from the background levels of cancer, it actually doesn't, like in reality, it doesn't matter or shouldn't matter for our decision-making process.
Well, no, I don't think that, I think that's a fallacy because you can't measure it, but there is, again, a compelling argument why there are effects even below that threshold or below the statistically significant threshold, because
why does it matter?
A single DNA lesion can lead to cancer. So, but of course, the risk is low. So there are arguments why it should be. You should consider it linear, and as a practical matter in regulation, there's a precautionary principle, and I think it is appropriate in this case.
But why does it matter if the net effect is no different than the background levels of cancer? Like, why should that come into our decision-making processes? Because there's a cost benefit for absolutely everything. And if what I'm saying is, if everyone received an extra amount of radiation up to a certain amount, but that led to a net zero effect on cancers, in any situation globally, at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, you can't tease out.
Yeah, but we're talking about detection versus actual disease. So between cause and effect. So that's the fallacy. You can't say because it's not detectable, that it's not there. So people are being.
But I can say it doesn't matter, right? On the aggregate,
well, it matters. It matters to the extent that your regulatory system. We're not talking about whether it matters or not. First, you have to establish what the guidelines are. You have to know what the facts are and what the evidence is, and then you make a public policy decision whether it matters or not. But by saying there's a threshold because we can't see it, so again, is a different statement from saying, well, yes, there is a dose effect below that value, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but for instance, we let people live in Colorado. Colorado, the people get 3 times the exposure of radiation than New York. But you can't tease it out in the aggregate data. We don't see 3 times more cancer deaths, even though we do see 3 times more radiation. So what I'm saying is we let people live in Colorado, right?
No, but that's a fallacy again. You have to stick to the data. So in other words, if you want to see an effect, you have to have an environmental epidemiological study that controls for all the confounding variables in a way so that you can actually make conclusions about that. And in a just a broad population study, like everyone living in Colorado above a certain altitude, that you have to control for all the confounding variables.
But what I'm saying is you can't possibly control for all the confounding variables in either situation. So what I'm saying is the permissible, like as a society, we've decided it is the cost benefit analysis of letting people live in Colorado, given that we have imperfect information on radiation at these low levels, it weighs in favor of us letting people live in Colorado. So that should be the same with other types of radiation exposure, whether it comes from Colorado or whether it comes from nuclear power plants.
See, no, but I think that's a specious argument. We don't have an agency that is governing where people live, but we do have an agency called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that regulates commercial activity, commercial activity that has the potential for ionizing radiation exposure, and it's their legal mandate to make sure that there's no undue risk from those operations. So it's really apples and oranges.
Well, I agree with you, but I think that's fundamentally the point that I have the contention with. We shouldn't have this regulatory body with the legal mandates to restrict nuclear power in the way that they do, because we don't have that same for other industries or for
no, of course you do. I mean, you have chemical exposures, all range of toxics. You have a health consequence of these exposures that is fairly well characterized.
But they don't have the same legal mandate. They don't have the same legal mandate as the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, where they sit outside of the executive branch, right? And they're allowed to make cost benefit. The other organizations, like the FDA, is allowed to make cost-benefit trade-offs when they issue permission for a drug. They're allowed to say, listen, we know that a certain amount of people are allergic to penicillin, but we are still going to allow penicillin to kill a few people every year because of all the lives that it's.
Yeah, but the NRC has exactly the same. It's a little complicated because of their regulation, or how dates back to the founding of the Atomic Energy Commission, the Atomic Energy Act, which has this no undue risk principle,
right? Which is different than the
public health and safety. It doesn't say how you define that, so that's been defined over the decades by the agency. But the way it works today under the law is that there's a kind of basic adequate protection standard, which essentially allows the entire population of nuclear plants today to keep operating. So it's almost a de facto. What's happening today is safe enough, because the NRC hasn't shut down a plant on safety grounds for decades. Okay, so that's right. Sort of the de facto situation.
Yeah, but they do make it cost prohibitive to build new ones, as we've seen.
Well, no, I don't think. I think the NRC scapegoated. We can talk about that later. But then, so what? But the NRC is under the law. They do have a cost benefit requirement if they go above adequate protection. And so there is a a legal requirement called the backfit rule, that if the NRC wants to impose a regulation that's stricter, that imposes a higher standard than this current baseline of adequate protection, that it has to be a substantial safety enhancement, and it has to meet a cost-benefit test. So they do have cost-benefit requirement. In fact, that rule has been used to essentially block a whole range of additional safety enhancements, many of which were proposed after Fukushima that I think were appropriate. So actually the case today is that they are using cost-benefit analysis to not improve safety, even in ways where I think it's appropriate.
Well, I just don't understand how you can possibly improve safety upon 0 deaths in the case of an accident. Like, I don't understand why it's the NRC or anyone's responsibility to tell an industry, you can't have an accident in the case of the largest tsunami the Earth has ever seen, and the second largest earthquake that the Earth has ever seen, or in human history. Why is that the responsibility of an agency to tell them you can't have the accident? The responsibility of the agency should be like, okay, if the accident happens up to a certain level of accident, right? Even buildings, we don't say you have to protect against a 10.0 earthquake. We say, hey,
and either
building to collapse.
It's exactly the same way with the NRC. They, of course, their standard is what they call reasonable assurance of adequate protection. It's not even adequate protection. So they have a pretty strict.
I guess philosophically, I'm still trying to wrap my head around why we're treating a nuclear accident as a high consequence event when 0 people die in the case of
0 people don't die. If there's exposure to ionizing radiation, there will be illness and mortality associated.
But there wasn't. In the case of Fukushima, we saw what happened. We saw every single safety system fail. We saw the roof blow off. We saw 3 gigawatts worth of nuclear material meltdown, and there wasn't enough radiation exposure to cause a single cancer.
Well, we don't know that because there haven't been epidemiological studies enough to demonstrate whether there's actually not only.
Yeah, but I could say that about. I could say, hey, you walked outside yesterday. There aren't enough epidemiological studies to see if you killed somebody from stepping on a.
Yeah, but that's specious. We're talking about, all right. So there is an accident. There's radiation exposure. There were populations around Fukushima. They were not evacuated appropriately. They were evacuated too late. They were moved into areas where there was actually more exposure than they realized. There was a community more than 25 miles away from Fukushima where they didn't realize that they were under a plume of highly concentrated cesium-137 for a month.
Yeah, but
under standards, they should have been evacuated.
You say highly concentrated, but there was not high enough concentration to hurt anyone. I mean, the numbers we're talking about are minuscule.
No, again, it doesn't. They're not minuscule on a population-wide basis.
So how many?
Our estimates are that
probably. So what's your estimate?
Probably 1,000 or more cancer deaths will occur from Fukushima.
And where are we getting that from? No other agencies have said that.
Yeah, no, actually, the World Health Organization did, and also the UN UNSCEAR committee provided estimates of the population dose. These are crude estimates.
Yeah, population dose, but they also said that it would lead to 0 deaths. Both of those organizations you said didn't say 1,000; they said 0. No,
because. I mean, you need to start with a common set of facts. So I'm not, I'm not disputing that you can interpret or in a regulatory system, you can value these consequences differently, but you need to know what the likely consequences are. And if there are radiation exposures, there were children who got radioactive iodine exposures at levels where there could be disease. But again, in order, there are 2 steps here. You can't say there was no effect. If people are exposed to ionizing radiation, there will be an effect.
Okay.
So the question is, there are two parts. So one is, can you do an epidemiological study to show that there's a statistically significant excess? And also, can you estimate from the likely exposures whether you would even be able to see that? Okay. So you may not be able, because of the level of exposure compared to background, you might not be able to see it but it doesn't mean it's not there.
It does mean it's not there.
No, it doesn't.
Of course it does. Okay, let's look at another scenario.
That's a fallacy.
That's not a fallacy. That's logically consistent. I mean, let's look at this.
No, it's not logically consistent because if an effect can't be detected in an epidemiological study,
then on a practical basis,
not there.
It didn't exist. Yes, of course.
No,
on a practical basis.
People who actually because there's also the relationship between exposure and between dose and consequence.
So let me ask you this question. I mean, you're saying that any amount of excess radiation exposure we should consider as a potential threat to human health, right?
Well, there's a linear no threshold hypothesis.
But you're saying any amount, right?
Well, the linear no threshold hypothesis essentially says you can extrapolate that linear a dose response relationship that's been detected at higher doses from Fukushima, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki studies, as well as a range of other studies around the world. For instance, there was just a meta-analysis published very recently of, I think, 26 large-scale radiation worker studies that's essentially confirmed the same dose-response relationship that's already established in regulation. And so then the question is, again, can you extrapolate that linear dose-response relationship below where the current data allows you to make a statistically significant conclusion? And again, there's the by far the accepted view is that there is a basis for using the linear no threshold hypothesis because of the.
I get it. You use the linear no threshold.
Single ionizing radiation exposure can lead to cancer, but it's a low risk.
So let me ask you a question. Do you hug your wife?
That's personal.
Okay. Well, yeah, I hug my girlfriend, and every time that I do, every single second I hug her, she gets exposed to an excess 500 gamma radiations. Right, gamma, like serious ionizing radiations, will leave my body and hit her body.
From what isotope?
That's from potassium-40. And yep, that's out of the 5,000 that happen every second, 500 of them actually escape the body and will hit something next to you. Now, when I breathe, every single breath I breathe out, it's 1.2 billion carbon-14 atoms are exuded. And so when I'm close to somebody, I'm giving them an excess carbon-14 radiation exposure as well. Should we limit human contact for that same reason?
I mean, that's reductio ad absurdum. We're talking about an agency regulating nuclear power. We're not talking about...
but your thousand deaths that you calculated was based on this, what I consider fallacious linear no threshold theory, right? And you're saying, no, we should practically regulate according to that. But that would also mean no more hugging people.
I mean, look, I don't see, there's of course, ionizing radiation is part of the natural environment. It's part of the background. It's something that we live with, but that isn't, I mean, there are toxic chemicals in the environment, natural chemicals and poisons, right? And we don't accept that we shouldn't regulate toxic chemicals because there are poisons in the environment. It's not logical, and I totally reject that whole way of thinking. We're talking about, we're talking about an industry, we're talking about an agency that needs to regulate the safe use of a carcinogen.
But you're saying regulate it down to zero, even though we can't.
I'm not saying regulate down to zero. I'm saying you need to establish what the actual dose response is, what your assumptions are, and then you make policy decisions.
Right. But the 1,000 excess deaths that you calculated from Fukushima was from a consideration down to zero. It wasn't. You didn't put a threshold, did you?
That would be based on population dose.
But did you create? Did you have a threshold? Did you create a threshold?
No good data on individual doses.
Right. But you made up that 1,000 number. I mean, the number that I've seen published over time and time again is zero if you consider a threshold.
I didn't make up this. This is based on the estimated population dose. Both my colleagues and I confirmed, as well as what WHO.
Right. I take no issue with the amount of dose that was received. I'm taking that as pure fact. What where my contention with your argument is how you then interpreted that dose to calculate a certain number of deaths.
Right, but again, what is your basis? So the common, what is your basis for concluding that that there is an effective threshold for ionizing radiation?
At the point where you cannot tease out excess deaths from background cancer deaths, that's the threshold. So that's the practical threshold. Whether or not it's true on any...
But I don't agree, because people are still being harmed. It's just there isn't enough statistical significance to detect that. But if there's a dose-response relationship, people are being harmed, and you can't pretend that that's not occurring. So, so I just reject that line of thinking.
Of course, you can say, well, first of all, theoretically somebody is being harmed.
Look, I mean, let me
but if at the end of the day,
I don't think this is a useful, you know, if you want the industry to thrive, I don't think by denying the harm that is a useful or a productive way to go. So I mean, I think, I don't understand why people in the industry, and I don't think the industry itself, I don't think the Nuclear Energy Institute's particularly supportive of, because they have.
No, they're with you. No, hold on. I stand apart from the industry on this. They're with you, right?
They're not with me. I mean, they're fighting every day to not have to weaken safety regulations. I disagree. That's what they do. They think there are excessive costs, but of course they have their own workers to protect. And
I've seen the exact opposite. I've seen the nuclear industry lobbying for increased costs because that is their business. Their business is taking an otherwise standard coal plant and tacking on $9 billion and then $9 billion extra price tag with unnecessary safety systems to make it a nuclear plant, right? Why does a nuclear plant cost $10 billion for a gigawatt plant today instead of the $1 billion that it costs to build a coal plant? It's $9 billion worth of unnecessary safety equipment to save 0 lives in the case of an accident.
All right. Well, that's a pretty reductionist. I mean, then we have no common basis of understanding here. But the 10 billion is not because of the need for additional safety systems. In fact, if you're talking about the AP1000s that are under construction at the Vogtle site in Georgia, that plant was designed specifically to reduce the capital cost of nuclear power by eliminating a lot of the safety systems in the current generation nuclear plants, and that hasn't saved them any money.
That's not true. They've added so many.
It has nothing to do with regulation. It's nothing to do with the NRC.
It
has to do with the competence of the industry.
Hold on. You can't say that it has nothing to do with regulations of the NRC. When they were building it, the NRC walked in and said your rebar is off by 1/8 of an inch, and so they had to tear up $1 billion worth of concrete.
No, actually, in most cases, they're letting defective rebar sit there. But but actually,
defective rebar. What's defective rebar?
Yeah, no. Often they do. There are a lot of there are a number of problems with the construction of that plant where they haven't been meeting the specifications that they committed to, that the NRC has allowed to.
Okay, but this is the point. This is the point. You know, they set up these parameters for rebar spacing, right? That were just so ridiculous. Right? It's like, plus minus 1/8 of an inch instead of, industry standard, which would be plus minus.
It's not ridiculous. That's the core of doing good construction.
But no, but that doesn't change the strength of the building. Being within a 1/8 band instead of an inch band does not change the strength profile.
No, these are based on codes and standards, which are established that they're largely incorporated into the regulations because of their codes and standards for building construction. I mean, that's part of the critical aspects of civil engineering. So, I mean, to start arguing about that is not fruitful either. In fact,
no, sure, it's fruitful because it's not the common civil engineering standards. This was above and beyond the common.
Well, no, I mean, there are when there's construction that's has to meet nuclear grade standards, then it has to meet a stricter standard. But that's because you're crediting those systems for safety features as part of the analysis. And again,
this is my point.
If you don't think there's any risk with nuclear power, first of all, there's no common basis.
I didn't say there's any risk with nuclear power. What I did say is when 3 gigawatts worth of light water reactors melts down, when every single safety system fails due to world's largest tsunami and the world's largest earthquake, and 0 people die from that.
We don't
maybe
know
if you went a little
we
bit
don't know
too
that
far.
0 people have died. In fact, again, because we know that there were radiation exposures from those accidents, that there will be cancer fatalities because of those exposures.
No.
They haven't been determined yet.
But that was, that was our previous argument. There's no basis for saying that there.
Well, I don't agree with that. And and you can't. Well, I don't understand. You make claims. You can't just assert that there are 0 deaths if you don't even have a study.
I'm not asserting that. That's what the UN and that's what the UNSCEAR and that's what the WHO said. 0 deaths. You took their dosage and then you calculated your own version of number of deaths.
No one said there are going to be 0 deaths.
I can pull it up on the UNSCEAR page.
Go ahead. I mean, there were individuals. I mean, a lot of the cases, the individual doses aren't even known because the exposure to evacuees and populations hasn't been well characterized. So you can't even if you believe there's a threshold, you can't conclude that no one was exposed to above that threshold.
I mean,
and
whether we,
I mean,
not only was it well characterized, not only was it well characterized, it's orders of magnitude lower than what you need to have an adverse effect from radiation.
How do you know that? Have you done a population survey? Have you studied the movements of evacuees compared to the plume contamination to ground contamination? I mean, you're saying ridiculous things. And if you want to establish credibility, you can't just dismiss. I mean, that you can't dismiss the established basis for how you understand and study these issues.
Let me put it this way.
How to handle
Let me put it this way.
It's really ridiculous.
Let me put it this way. There was no area outside the site boundary of Fukushima that had radiation exposure levels that could have possibly caused a cancer. So you don't.
That's absolutely not true.
Well, you're saying that based on the fact that even a single ionizing radiation event.
No, there were people who got exposures of. I'd have to look at the data, but there were dose rates on the order of probably many millirem an hour over the course of weeks. And some children got doses to the thyroid that were in the realm where they should have gotten potassium iodide prophylaxis, but they didn't. These are doses
what rates? Because maybe you and I are talking on 2 different scales. There was not a single member of the public that was exposed to a rate above 100 millisieverts, cumulated dose.
100 millisievert. That's pretty high.
100. We've never been able to prove a cancer event statistically in any epidemiological study underneath 100 millisieverts.
No, that's not true.
That was the result of the LSS study from Hiroshima.
There are other studies that have found statistically significant excesses below that.
At what rate? Give me a rate. What, 50 millisieverts? 10 millisieverts? Either way, no one outside of the site boundary even got exposed to 10 millisieverts.
That's not clear. But again, you're confusing the statistically significant lower bound from the lifespan studies with the absence of an effect. And that is not the established, the vast consensus of radiation protection experts believes, that National Council on Radiation Protection Measurements, the ICRP, every established organization believes that there is a sound technical basis for the linear no threshold hypothesis below that threshold. So, I mean, again,
you're correct. You're correct. By the way, that is a fact. The NCRP does say that you should subscribe to the linear no threshold, but that's bogus. That would be crazy.
Frankly,
crazy to do so.
I mean, if you reject the recommendations of the professional bodies that do this for a living, I mean, I can't help you. I mean, UCS believes in scientific integrity, and we believe, and we focus on facts and argument and evidence, and where there are uncertainties, we understand them. But you don't just reject the expertise of scientific bodies, of the professionals who work in this field. I mean, you can't. There's no common basis for understanding. That's not the basis for building a sound.
No. We have a common basis. Hold on. We have a totally common basis, a totally common foundation. We both agree on what the data was collected on the dose rates, and we both agree that the ICRP and these other radiation protection bodies subscribe to the linear no threshold model. But the linear no threshold model does not. What I think our contention is derived from is that I say that the linear no threshold model does not make sense from a pragmatic or a cost benefit perspective.
But you said there was no.
We wouldn't hug our.
You're contradicting yourself now, because you said that it wasn't going to affect anyone if it was below a 10 rem dose.
What I'm saying is the net effect.
Now you're saying that it's from a cost benefit. It doesn't matter.
No. What I'm saying. Hold on.
I accept if you believe it doesn't matter.
I say both of them.
Fine.
I say both of them. I say both of them. The net effect of being beneath a certain threshold is zero, right? What I'm saying is, on aggregate, if 1,000 people
net effect
with that,
I don't know what net effect means. The net effect is greater than zero.
No, the net effect is zero if you cannot tease the data out of an epidemiological study.
No, that is absolutely not true. It's just not true.
Well, what you're saying is the effect isn't zero. What I'm saying is the net effect isn't zero.
I don't know what net effect means.
The net effect means the additional number of deaths off of a baseline standard. So yes,
baseline standard. You're talking about the background rate of cancer.
Right, the background rate of cancer. So the background rate of cancer would have killed 1,000 people. Whether or not they got that extra dose of radiation up to a certain threshold, there would have still been 1,000 deaths. And so what I'm saying is that means that logically you can ignore that extra amount of radiation.
I don't agree, because the people who get a cancer from that radiation exposure and die cannot be ignored.
They're not being ignored. They would have gotten cancer anyway. That's what we're saying.
No. That
yes,
makes sense.
that's what net means.
You don't understand.
That's what net equals zeros means.
No, you're talking about an individual. The individual background radiation exposure. Okay, we know on average it's probably about 100, 200 millirem a year. Okay, so maybe 1 millirem a day. Okay, if someone were to get a 1,000 millirem dose from exposure from an accident like Fukushima, in a few hours or even a few days, it's going to be greatly over their background exposure. That's going to be a significant increase in their cancer risk.
What I'm saying is that no one outside the boundary had an increase in their cancer risk. Whether or not
you have no basis for making that statement. Show me a study. Give me a reference.
LSS study. That's your reference. The LSS study shows a clear threshold at 100 millisieverts.
It doesn't show a threshold. It shows where there's a statistically significant, where the data enables you to make a firm conclusion. But again, that is coupled with the biological basis for the cancer induction of ionizing radiation. So, I mean, look, you want to make a technically valid argument, okay? Then you have to provide references that support it. And I haven't heard anything.
But that, yeah,
I haven't heard anything.
Yeah, but
You're just
but the argument,
your own opinions. I can write a paper and have references and submit it for peer review. Go ahead.
It's funny.
And you have your opinions, but they're worth nothing, Bret. Sorry.
That's funny. That is what the de facto argument. Whenever somebody feels like they've been outgunned, they say, "Go write a paper."
I'm not outgunned. You haven't. I mean, I'm not going to accept your assertions about stuff that you obviously have no basis for. So I don't.
You asked for a citation. I gave you a citation.
You didn't give a citation.
Okay. Well, I personally have enjoyed this conversation. We're about out of time. It's fun debating these ideas. I think this is important overall because it allows people to then, go off into the world and do their own studies and conclude their own opinions. It's good to bring together differing ideas. So I, for one, Ed Lyman, very much appreciate you coming on the show today. And I hope
Sure.
that we can continue these debates in a productive manner, maybe over beer someday in the future.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Ed.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.